Is the whiskey world in danger, either because of collapse or consolidation? No, I don't think so. I guess we can end the video now. I feel like the title is a little bit clickbaity, but I keep getting this question, and so I thought, oh, fine, let's answer it. I'm Daniel Whittington. I'm the Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School. There's a little bit of noise in the background. If you're hearing that, it's because we're doing construction out there, and we decided to shoot anyway. So my actual answer is no, the whiskey's industry is not in danger at all. At all. Everything's going to be fine. Now, is it changing? Yes. Is it going to change more? Absolutely. How? Kind of, who knows? But here's some clues and some directions that I think things might go. The history of whiskey is this constant flux and give and switch and change between small producers or craft or even home distillation and big corporate company products, right? So in Scotland and Ireland, it was all craft because it was just home distillation, right up until we start getting into, 1700s, 1800s. Except was it? Because there's actually predating that, records of the kings giving licenses to the lords to do large-scale production of whiskey for the king and for a whole area. So already we've got corporate interest, the king, and small craft producers. Early on in Scottish history, Irish history is a little more small than, but by the time we get into the late 1700s, early 1800s, Ireland is, in Dublin, almost entirely massive company, huge production facilities, and then a bunch of craft way out there beyond the pale. And Canada. And by the way, craft. Whole new movement, small producers showing up to launch and push the whole industry forward. Canada, other than home distillers, had massive, huge corporate distillation like way early on. Late 1700s, the first big commercial distillery in Canada, I think, was 1767, which was James Grant, but that was a rum distillery in Quebec. It wasn't whiskey until later, and it became, the brands that like Seagram's and things like this, the bigger names. But they're already huge corporate and English, by the way, interests in Canadian whiskey. Not a ton of craft already. Partially because Canada is so segmented into big populations surrounded by nothingness, but in like most of middle Canada. But in the last 30 years, if you start with Glenora, you've got an explosion of craft in Canadian whiskey. Ooh, yes. Okay, in the U.S., we're actually closer to the story of the U.K. We have a bunch of small distillers, but already by the time we get into America becoming a country, we have the battle between craft and corporate, with the East Coast big producers getting all the edge over all these small mom and pop frontier distillers. And geez, in the last 30 years in America, we're climbing, 3,000 to 5,000 distilleries in North America, or in the U.S.? I mean, astronomical change. So if this has always been the case, and this is the world we're living in now, why is everyone freaking out? Well, I mean, no one likes change, but we'll talk about that in a second. So this is Benriach. This is a great distillery. I've always loved Benriach. They tend to be a sherry cask forward for me in most of the releases, although one of my favorite Benriachs is more bourbon than sherry. This is one that I found on the shelf at Total Wine, and I was like, oh, I haven't tried that one. Let's do a review on it. It's the Cask Edition 2010. This is Pedro Jimenez Puncheon aged. Cask is 3683 if you're drinking along at home. Benriach has a really interesting story. Their current master blender is Rachel Berry, who's just an all-around whiskey badass. I think that's her official title. In the Scottish language, it translates to master blender, but we all know what that actually means. Yeah. It's so rich. Benriach goes back ages. They were their neighbors to Longmorn, one of my favorite distilleries. They got shuttered at one point, but still did the maltings for Longmorn, and they crashed during the Pattison failure. That was why. That's a whole whiskey story that maybe we'll go into. That actually, the Pattison failure might be a more relevant warning for today. So yeah, I'm going to write that up. We're going to talk about that. I don't know why that just now occurred to me, but it did. So they got reopened by Glenlivet Distillers. At one point, they were owned by Seagram's, who then got absorbed into Pernod. And then they got bought back out by a small group who bought Glendronach and Benriach and then did Glenglassaugh. And then they sold Benriach off to Brown-Forman. So now this is a Brown-Forman product. And it is really fruity, like candied plums and grape. Lots of berries, lots of rich depth and cream. Little bit of a malt funk, but more of the sherry sulfuric note to it. But not like sulfur, but just like that. There's a faintiness to sherry that's really nice if you like sherry cask whiskeys, and it's definitely in there. Oh, man. This is everything I love about a Speyside sherried scotch. Just rich butter and berry pastries, jammy, little bit dry, long oily finish. Yeah. I mean, well, for one, it is cask strength, which for this one is 59.3. There's only 660 of these bottles, so the odds that you're drinking with me is probably low. But they did a whole bunch of cask releases, and if you can't get this single cask, Benriach does independent bottlings with like Berry Brothers and Rudd, and you can find single casks of theirs. It's worth looking up. Oh, yeah, that's nice. Okay, so whiskey industry. I'm going to add water too. The big corporate guys, they're always going to be relatively fine. I think there's an argument to be made that right now some of the Kentucky brands are putting down way more whiskey than there is demand, and maybe they'll be able to create that demand at some point, but I think we're more likely to see about 5 or 6 years from now a really high level of white labeled sourced products from the bigger producers instead of just MGP and Bardstown and, so on. Nice. But you got to remember that the big corporations, like Brown-Forman or Diageo, they do forecasting, which just means like, how are we going to make money? Where are we going to spend money for the next however long? And they don't do forecasting for like next year. They do. But they also do forecasting for like 20 years from now. And they're looking at the landscape way ahead of most people. So the chances of them overreaching in a way that creates a true disaster, pretty small. Now, could there be a crisis and something goes wrong? Yeah, but what's going to happen with somebody like Diageo or Brown-Forman is they're just going to sell off a distillery or temporarily close one, and then when times pick back up, reopen it, which is exactly what they're doing right now, reopening Port Ellen and so on, right? Craft is the one where most people are worried, and I get that because we went from none to thousands of craft distilleries available, and that is hard to keep up. I don't know if you've noticed recently, but in most real liquor stores, the whiskey aisle in the last 10 years has gone from being a section to being like 3 rows. It's overwhelming. There's just not enough life hours in the day to try all of the interesting things on the shelf. And so I keep saying this, but if craft distilleries open and their goal is to take on Buffalo Trace, they're screwed unless they get bought by Buffalo Trace. But if their goal is to make really great whiskey for the smaller community, like a band, to reach their fan base and serve it well, then they can make a healthy living and make whiskey for a living. And they can do it as long as they desire to, if they run the business well. But craft distilleries are no different than any other small business in the world. And small business success rates are low. I can't remember what the numbers are, so I'm not going to make them up. but the numbers are very depressing about how many small businesses close within the first 2 years of being open or starting. It's enough to make you balk at starting a small business, unless you're slightly delusional, like me and all of the people at Wizard Academy who think that somehow we're going to be the exception to that rule, which is why our mascot is Don Quixote. But I think over the next decade, you're going to see a bunch of craft distilleries close. And it's not going to be because, oh my God, the whiskey industry is collapsing. It's going to be because it didn't make the money they hoped it would, or it didn't make any money, or they just got tired because it's a lot of work and they decided to change industries and they couldn't find a buyer. And you're going to see a natural consolidation of craft distilleries. And then you're going to see just as many new ones open who go like, no, I can do it. And that ebb and flow is going to keep happening. Simultaneously, what big brands have done for the entire history of whiskey is going to keep happening, which is the really successful craft brands are going to get bought by the big corporations and either turned into a much bigger brand or rolled into a portfolio. And that's normal. But I guess I'm mostly shooting this video to tell you, stop the hand wringing. I get really frustrated in any category, not just whiskey, where I walk into a group and everyone's like, oh no, what's gonna happen? Everything, oh my God, the sky is falling. It's such a waste of energy, such a waste of emotional energy. And just don't be one of those people. I will tell you this. This is the synopsis. And by the way, with a little water, true berries and cream. Oh, and the slight spiciness of the sherry comes right to the front, but it's still really jammy pastry. It's a delicious whiskey. If you love whiskey, you've never been alive in a better time than right now. And for the foreseeable decades, never been alive at a better time. What do you do about it? Go buy craft whiskey. If you want craft whiskey to stay alive and you're worried about them closing, then buy the whiskey from the ones you don't want to close. That's literally how that works. Never take your advice from the people who see the whole world through a lens of fear. It's not a great way to live. So, in the meantime, let's drink good whiskey. I'm really glad you're here.